The sound of a violin drifted softly through the golden ballroom, wrapping the air in a kind of warmth that felt far away from me. The chandeliers above reflected in the polished marble floors. Around me, 280 guests were laughing, clinking champagne glasses brushing against each other in silk and satin. I stood at the edge of it all with nothing in my hand but a glass of water. My back was against the wall near the entrance. No one looked my way. No one ever did at these things. My sister Caroline was standing in the center of the room, glowing in her silk wedding dress, surrounded by people who adored her. Her laughter rose above the music as if the night itself belonged to her. And maybe it did. My father, Richard Cole, tapped his glass with a spoon. The violin stopped. The chatter dimmed. Every eye turned toward the man I had learned to fear long before I could articulate why. His face was flushed, his tie slightly loosened, the scent of bourbon carried across the space like a warning. He raised his glass and said, "Tonight, we have a special gift for our Caroline." He paused, letting the words hang like bait. Her sister has decided to give her the historic house on Magnolia Street. A wave of clapping erupted. Whistles. Someone shouted, "Congratulations!" My sister's eyes widened in that perfect performance of surprise she had perfected since childhood. Her hand covered her mouth, but I could see the tiny curl at the edge of her smile. It was not surprise. It was victory. My fingers tightened around the cold glass of water. That house was mine. I built it from nothing. I restored every floorboard, every window pane, every stubborn inch of its foundation. It was the only thing that was truly mine. And now, in front of nearly 300 people, he had tried to hand it to her as if I were invisible. I walked forward, not rushed, not trembling, just steady. The sound of my heels echoed against the marble as I moved closer to him. I felt their stares like heat on my skin. "That's a lie." My voice was steady and loud enough to cut through the silence. "I never agreed to this." The ballroom fell still. "You could have heard a pin drop," a few guests whispered. One woman in a green dress leaned toward her husband and said, "Is she serious?" Another man muttered, "She should be happy for her sister." My father's smile thinned into something sharp. He began to walk toward me slow and deliberate, the glass of champagne tilting slightly in his hand. His breath smelled like liquor. "Don't you dare embarrass us tonight." His voice was low but venomous, like the way he used to whisper when no one else could hear. I met his eyes. I had avoided doing that for most of my life, but not tonight. "It's mine." The shift in him was instantaneous. The champagne glass tilted, his mouth twisted. "Not anymore," he shouted. His hand shot out. His fingers dug into my shoulder like iron hooks. He slammed me against the cold stone wall behind me. The sound that followed was sharp and violent. Crack! Someone screamed. A glass shattered somewhere. Pain exploded in the back of my head. My vision blurred for a heartbeat. Warmth spread down my neck. It took me half a second to realize it was blood. The world tilted sideways. Around us, people gasped. Caroline stood frozen, her perfect smile gone eyes wide. A young man near the bar was holding up his phone. I caught the red light on the corner of the screen. He was live streaming the whole thing. I could hear a woman cry out, "Oh my God!" He slammed her. Another voice shouted for someone to call 911. My knees shook, but I stayed standing. Not because I was strong, because I had spent years being trained by this family to not fall. My father's hand still hovered near my shoulder as if ready to strike again. The ballroom had turned into a storm. Guests were backing away. Someone dropped a drink. Someone else pushed through the crowd trying to reach me. I tasted blood in the corner of my mouth. My father stared at me like I was the problem, the same way he always had, as if my existence was a rebellion against his perfect family image. I felt something settle inside me, not panic, not fear, clarity. I lifted my chin. For once, I didn't look away. The flashing of phones lit up the room like 100 tiny spotlights. My sister finally rushed toward him, grabbing his arm and hissing something I couldn't hear. The damage was already done. My blood was dripping onto the white marble floor. The sound of sirens was faint, but growing louder outside. The last thing I remember before the EMTs arrived was a woman's trembling voice somewhere in the corner of the room whispering, "It's all live. It's everywhere." In that moment, through the ringing in my ears, I understood something with perfect clarity. He had tried to silence me in front of everyone, but this time the whole world had heard it. I grew up in a house where the sun only ever seemed to shine on my sister. Caroline was the one who could do no wrong, the girl with the soft curls, the gentle laugh, the perfect manners. People reached for her without thinking, as if kindness itself followed wherever she went. I was the other one, the one standing in doorways watching the world applaud her. The one who learned early that quiet strength was invisible in our home. My earliest memories are of family gatherings where relatives bent down to tell Caroline how beautiful she looked, how bright her future would be, how she was the golden girl. I remember standing a few feet away holding a toy truck with a broken wheel listening as someone whispered to my mother, "That one will be difficult." I didn't know what difficult meant at the time. I only knew it didn't sound like love. I loved taking things apart, old radios, chairs. Once, when I was 9, I pulled apart a broken porch swing just to see how it fit together. My father found me with the nails scattered across the floor. His voice was hard as gravel when he told me to leave that to the men. Caroline walked in moments later wearing a pink dress. She twirled and the entire room lit up with smiles. That was how it always went. Her light dimmed everything else. By the time we were teenagers, the difference was a canyon. At every birthday, every holiday, every family reunion, Caroline was introduced as the one who would make the family proud. I was asked when I would finally stop being stubborn. When I got my first part-time job to save money for design school, my father said it was a phase. My mother told me I was wasting time. Caroline, on the other hand, was encouraged to dream about weddings and babies, about hosting Christmas dinners in a house someone else would provide. She was treated like a prize to be displayed, and I was treated like the background. It wasn't just the way they spoke to us. It was the way they looked at us. Caroline got softness. I got impatience. She got pride. I got silence. And silence cuts deeper than words when you're young. When I graduated high school with honors, my father barely mentioned it at the dinner table. When Caroline made it onto a community theater stage to play a tree in a school production, they threw her a small party. At first, I tried to make sense of it, tried to earn their applause. I stayed late after class working on blueprints and furniture sketches. I brought home awards from design competitions, but they never looked at me the way they looked at her, so I stopped trying to shine for them. I decided to build my own light. I moved out as soon as I could, pouring everything I earned into my work. I started a tiny interior design studio from a basement. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. While Caroline collected praise for getting engaged at a Christmas party, I spent long nights sanding down floorboards in a client's house to pay rent. When I visited home, nothing had changed. Caroline sat at the table, my mother brushing her hair, my father boasting to guests about her wedding plans. I stood by the doorway, listening to my achievements dissolve in the air like they had no weight. They didn't ask about my projects. They didn't care how many clients I had. They only ever said the same line. Caroline is our pride and joy. They meant it too. But the thing about growing up in someone else's shadow is that you learn how to survive without their light. You learn to build a world where their approval doesn't decide your worth. I learned to swallow my frustration until it turned into quiet resolve. Every cutting remark became another layer of armor. Every dismissal another reminder that my success had to be built away from them, not because they didn't see me, but because they never wanted to. The first time I showed them one of my finished projects, an old cottage I had restored with my own hands, they smiled politely and said, "That's nice." When Caroline announced her engagement a month later, they opened a bottle of champagne. I stood in that living room listening to their cheers and knew with icy certainty that my family would never celebrate me the way they celebrated her. That realization didn't break me. It carved me into something sharper. I learned to measure love not by words, but by actions. And their actions had always been clear. Caroline was the chosen one. I was the reminder of everything they didn't value. So I built a life they could not touch, And for years, that distance was enough. Until this wedding. Until this night. The house on Magnolia Street was nothing but a wreck the day I bought it. The porch was collapsing into itself, the paint peeled off in long gray strips like old skin. The front door hung loose on rusted hinges. To everyone else, it looked like a forgotten carcass of a place, a house that should have been torn down years ago. To me, it was possibility. I had saved for years, cutting corners on everything from coffee to rent, taking jobs most designers turned down just to have enough to claim something of my own. When I stood in front of that decaying house for the first time, I didn't see rot. I saw a blank canvas. I spent the first winter living out of one small room on the second floor, wrapped in layers of blankets because the heating system barely worked. Every morning, I woke before sunrise, pulled on work boots, and sanded down floorboards until my fingers went numb. My hands ached. My back screamed. But every sound of the hammer hitting wood, every creak of the staircase coming back to life felt like a heartbeat. I fixed it piece by piece, slowly resurrecting what everyone else had abandoned. I restored the stained glass windows that had been shattered, each shard carefully set back into place. I spent entire nights on the porch replacing the railing, letting the smell of sawdust fill the air. I scraped paint, laid tiles, reinforced the roof, and installed the lights with my own hands. It wasn't just construction. It was creation. It was mine. By the second year, the house no longer sagged when the wind blew. The floors shone beneath soft lighting. The fireplace roared on cold nights. I filled it with plants, with sketches of my next projects, with the sound of quiet music echoing through rooms that once held only silence. Magnolia Street became the first place I ever felt safe. I hosted friends from the design community. We'd drink cheap wine in the kitchen and they would run their hands along the reclaimed oak counters and say, "This is magic." But it wasn't magic. It was sweat grit and a stubborn refusal to let anyone decide what I could or couldn't build. I remember the first time my parents came to visit. They didn't even bother to hide their disappointment. My father stood on the porch, looked around and said, "Why would you pour money into this old thing?" My mother shook her head at the mismatched chairs I had carefully chosen, calling them junk. Caroline didn't even step inside. She just laughed and said it smelled like sawdust. I should have expected it. In their world, a house was only valuable if someone else had built it for you. They didn't see the beauty in the work. They only saw the before, never the after. So I stopped inviting them. I let the house be mine alone. It became my sanctuary after every exhausting day. A place where I didn't have to explain my worth to anyone. I cooked meals on the stove I installed myself, sat on the porch swing. I rebuilt, watched the magnolia trees bloom every spring, their petals scattering like confetti on the street. It became a part of me. But the thing about family is that even when they ignore you, they never stop feeling entitled to what is yours. Every holiday dinner, my father would bring it up casually. "Caroline will need more space once she starts a family. You have that big house all to yourself." My mother would smile sweetly, as if it was logical, as if my years of labor didn't exist. "You're so independent, Maddie. You'll understand." They said it like my independence was a gift to them, like I was a bank account they could dip into whenever they wanted. Caroline would toss her hair and say how perfect the house would be for raising children, like it was already hers, like I had built it just to hand it over. At first, I laughed it off, convinced myself it was just talk. But over time, the way they said it changed. It became more certain, less hypothetical. As if my house was not a house, but a shared family asset. It wasn't. They hadn't spent freezing nights sanding down wood with bleeding knuckles. They hadn't hauled broken beams out the back door at 2 a.m. They hadn't spent years alone making something beautiful out of ruins. I had. So every time my father said Caroline will move in one day, I answered the same way. No, it's mine. I thought the word would be enough, that clear boundaries would mean something. But people who have never respected your boundaries don't suddenly start because you said no once. They push, they press, they wait for the perfect moment to take. Caroline started making little comments during family dinners, jokes about where she would place her nursery. My mother started dropping phrases like family home and shared legacy. My father's voice grew harder each time he said family comes first. But I knew what he meant. He meant her. Always her. In their eyes, my sweat and blood didn't make the house mine. Their last name did. They believed that anything I built alone belonged to the family the moment they decided they wanted it. That belief was the crack in the wall that would grow into the wrecking ball at Caroline's wedding. They thought I would do what I had always done: stay quiet, step aside, let Caroline shine. They didn't understand that the house on Magnolia Street wasn't just wood and brick. It was my rebellion carved into beams and glass. It was the only thing they could not rewrite. Or so I thought. The week before the wedding felt like standing in a quiet room and hearing the distant ticking of a bomb. No one said anything directly, but everything was coated in tension, a film you could feel on your skin. Caroline was everywhere, floating through fittings, brunches, spa appointments, bridal showers, wrapped in the glow of being adored. She walked through every space like the world owed her its applause. My parents orbited her like planets around a sun. I kept my distance, pretending not to notice the small things that told me something was coming. My father started drinking earlier in the day. He would sit on the back porch with his bourbon, looking at me with that half smile that was never really a smile. My mother would talk to me with a voice that sounded sweet, but carried a weight underneath little phrases meant to soften me up. Sisters support each other. Family shares. It would make Caroline so happy. She said it like my happiness didn't matter, like my life was something I could hand over wrapped in a ribbon. Caroline was bolder. She didn't even bother pretending it was a request. During one of the pre-wedding dinners, she sat across from me at the long table in my parents' dining room and said, "After the honeymoon, I think I'll have the nursery in the south wing. The sunlight is better there." She didn't even look at me when she said it. She looked at her fiancé, laughing softly as if my house was already theirs. My father nodded like it was a fact. My mother clasped her hands and said, "It will be perfect for their future family." I stared at them, trying to keep my face still, trying not to let the burn in my chest show. No one asked me what I thought because they already assumed my role. I was the one who made way, the one who said yes, the one who disappeared when Caroline needed to shine. I told myself to ignore it, to not let them pull me into another fight. I had spent years choosing peace over confrontation, even when peace felt like swallowing glass. But each comment chipped away at something inside me. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I found my father sitting alone in the living room with a drink in his hand, the amber liquid catching the light. He looked at me with that distant expression he always had when he was drunk enough to say the truth. "Caroline deserves everything. You'll understand one day." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I asked him what that had to do with me. He said, "Family comes first. You'll do the right thing." The right thing. Those 3 words had been a leash my entire life. They had used them to keep me quiet, to keep me in the shadows, to make me give away pieces of myself to keep their image intact. My mother cornered me the next morning while I was trying to leave the house. She touched my arm like she was being gentle, but there was nothing gentle in her grip. "Do not make a scene at your sister's wedding, Maddie. You will not take this away from her." It was strange how she said it like a threat when all I had done was exist. She didn't even give me the chance to respond. She simply turned and walked away, confident that my silence would follow her like it always had. Later that afternoon, Caroline showed up at the house on Magnolia Street without asking. She walked through the rooms as if she already owned them, brushing her hand against the walls, stepping onto the porch like she was claiming territory. She talked about colors for the nursery, paint for the kitchen, how she might turn my studio space into a playroom. Her fiancé trailed behind her, uncomfortable but not enough to stop her. I stood in the doorway, feeling the edges of my patience fray. I asked her to leave. She laughed. "You'll hand it over eventually." "You always do." The way she said it sliced through the air like a blade. She didn't even see me as a person with something to lose. I was just an obstacle, an older sister trained to yield. When she left, the house felt different. It wasn't the sanctuary it had been for years. It felt invaded. It felt like they were already trying to erase me from it. Every corner carried the echo of her voice, already decorating rooms that weren't hers. That night, I sat on the porch swing I had rebuilt with my own hands, listening to the creak of the wood, the sound of magnolia leaves shifting in the breeze. I could feel something coming closer, heavy and inevitable. My father's drinking my mother's warnings, Caroline's arrogance. It all pointed in one direction. A storm was building. I told myself it would be fine if I stayed quiet, if I played along just enough to get through the wedding without a fight. But deep down, I knew that silence had a cost. It always did. Every time I chose silence, a piece of me disappeared. This time, though, something inside me refused to disappear any further. I didn't know how the fight would come or what it would look like, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, like a fault line waiting for the quake. The house was mine, and they were coming for it. The morning of the wedding was painted in soft gold light, but it felt like standing on a fault line waiting for the earth to split. The grand crest ballroom gleamed with hundreds of roses and candles arranged along the aisles, a reflection of Caroline's perfect image. Guests in silk dresses and tailored suits flooded through the entrance, laughing, sipping champagne, admiring the floral archway. I arrived alone wearing a deep navy dress I had chosen carefully. Simple but elegant, the kind of outfit that did not scream for attention, but still made me feel solid in my skin. As soon as I stepped through the doors, I felt the air shift. My mother's eyes scanned me from across the room like I was already a problem she needed to control. She walked over with a smile that didn't touch her eyes and said, "Don't ruin this day. Caroline deserves everything." I didn't answer. I just walked past her toward the reception area where the ballroom glowed beneath chandeliers. Caroline was radiant in her wedding gown, moving through the crowd like the star she had always been. People showered her with praise, with gifts, with the kind of attention I had never received even on my best day. My father Richard stood at the bar with a glass of bourbon in hand. His face was already flushed. His tie, crooked a smile spread across his face that was more like a sneer. The guests adored him as they always did because they only ever saw the performance, never the cost. The speeches were scheduled after dinner. I tried to keep to the edges of the room, focusing on the music, on anything that could drown out the storm building in my chest. But I felt it. Every look from my father. Every whisper between Caroline and her friends. They were waiting for something. Setting a stage I hadn't agreed to be on. When the clock struck 8, my father tapped his glass with a spoon. The room fell silent the way it always did when a man like him decided it was time to speak. The music stopped. The conversations died. All eyes turned toward him. He cleared his throat with exaggerated confidence. Tonight, he began, "We have something special. Something that proves how much family means to us. Caroline, my darling girl, you are starting a new life, and every new life deserves a strong foundation." He paused, his drunken eyes sweeping over the crowd, letting the anticipation grow. Then his voice sharpened. "Her sister has decided to give her the historic house on Magnolia Street as a wedding gift." The room erupted into applause. Champagne glasses clinked. People cheered. Caroline raised her hands to her mouth in an act so rehearsed it could have won her an award. She tilted her head toward me, her eyes glittering with triumph. It was not surprise. It was possession. I stood frozen for a second. The blood rushed in my ears. All I could see was the house. My house. The years of sweat and exhaustion. The nights sanding down floors until my hands bled. And now, he had taken it and offered it up like a trophy to his favorite child. My mother stood next to Caroline, nodding, basking in the warm glow of applause that didn't belong to her. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. She already knew what they had done. The sound of people clapping echoed through the ballroom. Someone shouted, "Congratulations!" Someone else said, "That's so generous!" I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble. The chatter faltered as I walked toward my father. "That's a lie," I said loud and clear. "I never agreed to this." The room froze. Whispers snapped through the air like dry branches breaking. My mother stiffened, but she didn't stop him. Caroline looked at me like I had ruined her coronation. My father laughed, that bitter, sharp laugh that always came before the worst things. "Don't you dare embarrass us tonight!" His voice carried across the room. I met his eyes and didn't look away. "It's mine." Those words weren't loud, but they cut through the air. His expression twisted the warmth of the room, gone in an instant. Not anymore, he snarled. His hand shot out. His fingers clamped down on my shoulder, and before I could breathe, he slammed me back against the stone wall behind me. The sound was violent. Crack! Gasps filled the ballroom. Someone screamed. I felt the sharp burst of pain shoot up the back of my head, warm blood sliding down my neck. My vision blurred, but I stayed on my feet. My father loomed over me, breathing hard, his jaw clenched in fury. Caroline stepped forward, but not to help. She was crying for attention, not for me. A young man near the bar was holding his phone up, red recording light blinking. The whole thing was being streamed. I heard a woman's voice, high and panicked. "Oh my God," he slammed her. Another shouted for someone to call 911. "Is he in?" My knees shook, but I straightened. I had lived my whole life being small around this man, but not now. Not when the entire room had seen him for what he was. My mother hissed something to him, trying to contain the scene, but the damage was already done. The crowd had seen the blood. They had heard the crack. They had watched the Golden family facade shatter like glass under a boot. The first sirens were already echoing outside. The night Caroline thought would crown her ended with my father's hand on me, the whole world watching. It was their trap, but they were the ones caught in it. The first thing I remember after the sound of my head hitting the wall was the antiseptic sting in the air. The ceiling above me was a pale, too bright white. A fluorescent light hummed somewhere overhead. I was lying on a gurney with a strap across my waist to keep me steady, a paramedic leaning over me with a focused expression. My hair was damp with blood, and the gauze around my head was warm. My chest ached where my father's hand had slammed me back, and every breath felt like it had to fight its way out of my ribs. I tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Another paramedic adjusted the oxygen tube and said softly, "Stay with us, Maddie." My throat burned, and the edges of the world were hazy, but I was awake, and that meant I had survived. Sirens wailed outside as the ambulance turned sharply. My pulse thudded against my temples in rhythm with the sound. I closed my eyes, but the ballroom flashed in my head like a broken reel of film. The wall, his voice, the sound of the crowd, the blood, and then that little red light on the phone recording it all. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the emergency room. A nurse with kind brown eyes was checking my vitals, adjusting the bandage wrapped around my head. She spoke softly, like someone trying to hold a cracked thing together. "You're going to be okay. You have a concussion and a deep cut, but nothing life-threatening." My hands trembled against the crisp hospital sheet. I tried to sit up, but the room tilted sideways and the nurse gently pressed me back down. "Don't. You hit your head hard. You need to rest." Another nurse came in with a tablet. She tapped something on the screen, then glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite place. I asked what was wrong, and she said nothing, but then she handed me the tablet. My heart clenched as I saw the screen. The video. The video of my father slamming me against the wall. It was everywhere. Someone at the wedding had streamed the entire thing live. It had been reposted across every platform before I even made it into the ambulance. The nurse's voice was quiet when she said, "It's already past 5 million views." Hashtags scrolled across the screen. Justice for Maddie. Wedding. Assault. Hashtag father slammed her. My name wasn't hidden anymore. My pain wasn't hidden anymore. It was public. And in a way I never expected that terrified me and made me feel seen at the same time. My phone buzzed on the small tray beside the bed. When the nurse handed it to me, the notifications flooded the screen faster than I could process them. Messages from coworkers, missed calls from unknown numbers, alerts from social media. Local news channels had already picked up the video. The clip of me standing up saying, "It's mine," before being slammed against the wall had become a symbol of something bigger than me. Commenters were furious, outraged. Strangers I had never met were defending me while my own family had stayed silent. The officer arrived not long after. She was calm, her uniform crisp, a notepad in her hand. She asked me if I wanted to press charges. My mouth was dry, but the word yes echoed in my chest even before I said it aloud. She explained the process carefully, making sure I understood every step. Assault charges, hospital records, video evidence, witness statements. Everything was already in motion. She told me, "This kind of case. With this much proof, it won't just disappear." Her words sank into me like cold water. For the first time in my life, the weight wasn't only on me to prove what he had done. The world had seen it. The nurse returned with water, her hands steady. When she spoke again, her tone was different, almost reverent. That took a lot of strength to say no in a room full of people like that. I didn't feel strong. I felt cracked down the middle. But I also felt something else flickering beneath the pain. A strange, hard clarity. For years, my family had counted on silence to keep their image intact. But this time, there was no silence left. This time, there was a video, and the world had already decided they would not be able to rewrite it. By the time the doctor came to check on me, the hallway outside my room was buzzing with activity. Hospital staff whispered to each other. A news anchor's voice floated faintly from a waiting room television down the hall. I caught a glimpse of my own name on the ticker at the bottom of the screen. In less than 6 hours, my father's assault wasn't just a family matter. It was national news. One of the nurses muttered that the press had already stationed outside the hospital waiting for a statement. I didn't want their cameras, but I also wasn't going to hide. Not anymore. Lying there under the sharp lights of the ER head-bandaged chest bruised the noise of the world growing louder outside the door. I understood something with startling simplicity. My father had hit me in a room full of people because he thought he still owned the narrative. But the second that phone started recording the story stopped belonging to him. It belonged to me, and I wasn't going to give it back. The morning after the assault, the hospital room was quiet except for the soft beep of the monitor and the muffled footsteps of nurses outside. My phone kept buzzing on the tray beside my bed, a stream of messages I didn't have the strength to read. The video had already escaped into the world, carried by people I didn't even know. 5 million views had turned into 9 overnight. News anchors were calling it a brutal act of family violence at a wedding. Hashtags kept multiplying, strangers posting things like, "She stood her ground," and "No means no." I was no longer just a woman with blood in her hair and bruises on her chest. I had become a headline. A nurse knocked softly and pushed open the door. She said there was someone waiting outside. A man. She asked if I wanted to see him. I didn't have to ask who. I already knew. Thomas Hale. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, not since he had moved out of Savannah to expand his real estate firm. He was one of the few people who had seen me build the house on Magnolia Street from nothing. He'd helped me carry lumber through thunderstorms and eat cold pizza on the porch when the kitchen didn't have plumbing yet. He walked in wearing a gray suit, sharp and deliberate, but his eyes softened when they landed on me. He didn't say, "You look terrible," or "I'm sorry." He just sat down and said, "I saw the video." My stomach tightened. Of course he had. Everyone had. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice steady. "You don't have to face this alone." I wanted to say I was fine, that I could handle it. I always said that, but my throat burned with words I didn't have the strength to shape. Instead, I stared at the bandage on my hand where the IV line ran and whispered, "They tried to take my house." His expression hardened in that way only someone who knew me well would recognize. He'd always understood that Magnolia Street wasn't just property. It was proof. It was survival. He told me he had already talked to his legal team. Thomas owned the property next to mine, a small stretch of land he had bought years ago. He knew exactly how much my house was worth, both in money and in story. "If they try to push you, we'll make it a legal wall," he said. "No loopholes. No negotiations." His tone wasn't gentle. It was steel. That was how Thomas helped. Not with sympathy, but with action. My phone buzzed again. My mother's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. He reached for the phone and flipped it over so the screen faced the bed. "Don't give them a chance to twist this," he said. "They'll try." And he was right. A few hours later, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice soaked in tears and manipulation. She said I was overreacting, that my father didn't mean it, that we should keep family matters in the family. She begged me to not press charges, to think of Caroline, to not ruin her perfect day. As if the broken skin on my head and the pain in my chest were less important than a floral centerpiece and a string quartet. Thomas sat back, listening, not interrupting. When the message ended, he exhaled through his nose, calm but sharp. That's not an apology. That's control. He wasn't wrong. I stared at the ceiling, a knot tightening behind my ribs. They weren't sorry for what happened. They were sorry I wasn't staying silent. Thomas asked if I wanted to record everything. Calls, messages. He said documentation mattered when people like my father tried to rewrite the story. He'd handled cases like this before in property disputes and assault suits tied to inheritance battles. He told me something that stuck. When power is challenged, the first thing they do is pretend it was never yours. I agreed to let him help. He set up a secure shared drive to store everything. Every voicemail, every text, every call. The next message came from Caroline. Her voice was shaking not with guilt, but with fury. She said I had ruined everything, that people were talking, that Brian's parents were furious that I should just say it was an accident so they could fix it. She said, "This isn't just about you, Maddie." And for the first time I said out loud, "Yes, it is." She fell silent on the other end before hanging up. It was strange how light the words felt, even though my chest ached. Thomas's legal team moved fast. He called one of his attorneys into the hospital room that afternoon, a woman with a sharp black bob and a calm presence. She introduced herself as Lena Park. She had already watched the video 3 times. She said, "This is not going to be buried. We'll make sure of it." She outlined the steps clearly. Assault charges were already in motion through the police. But on the property side, she could fortify every legal document tied to Magnolia Street. She explained that my parents could not force a transfer, not legally, but they could try to pressure me. She said, "The best thing we can do is make this public and airtight, a line they can't cross without destroying themselves." I felt a strange calm settle into my bones listening to her. For so long I had fought alone in the shadows, and now I wasn't alone. Thomas leaned closer and said, "Let them talk. Let them show the world who they really are. They're going to dig their own grave." By the time the sun set, the story was already exploding beyond what I could imagine. National talk shows were playing the video. Journalists were calling my lawyer's office. Local women's advocacy groups were tagging me in posts offering legal support and resources. My father's name was trending. People who had admired him for years were now calling for accountability. I could almost feel the foundation of their perfect image cracking under the weight of their own violence. And somewhere in that storm, a quiet thought formed in me. They had taken everything for granted because they had believed I would never fight back. But this time I wasn't just fighting. I had an army. Thomas stayed after Lena left, sitting quietly in the corner of the room while I scrolled through the messages flooding in. Strangers were sending messages of support, some sharing their own stories of family betrayal, of standing up and paying the price, but winning their lives back. He finally spoke, not looking up from the floor. "You know, Maddie, this isn't about a house anymore." I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. This was about a lifetime of being told to step aside. And now, the line had been drawn. The after-wedding brunch was supposed to be a polished affair, a carefully curated photo opportunity for Caroline's new life. It was held at the same ballroom where my father had slammed me against the wall less than 48 hours earlier. They hadn't even changed the flowers. The scent of roses still hung in the air, but it no longer smelled soft. It smelled like something rotting under perfume. I arrived just as the guests were taking their seats, their conversations carrying that uneasy mix of forced cheer and gossip. Everyone had seen the video. No one said it out loud, but I could see it in the way their eyes flicked toward me as I walked in. Whispers clung to the corners of the room like cobwebs. Thomas was at my side, calm, composed, wearing that quiet authority that made people step out of his way without quite realizing it. Lena followed behind us, holding a slim black folder under her arm, every step measured. I was wearing a white blouse and dark slacks. My hair pulled back, the bandage still visible beneath my hairline. I didn't want to hide it. I wanted them to look. At the front of the room, my parents stood near the buffet table, trying to hold their usual smiles, but their faces were too tight. Caroline was pale, her makeup heavier than usual, hands clasped nervously in front of her. Her fiancé was stiff, standing a half step away from her, as if unsure whether to move closer or farther. My mother saw me first. She stiffened, then forced a brittle smile and walked toward me with a brittle grace. "Maddie," she said through her teeth, "what are you doing here? This isn't appropriate." Her voice trembled not with fear for me, but with fear of losing control. I let her words fall to the floor. I didn't come to ask for permission. I came to make sure they didn't bury what they had done. My father spotted me next. His expression darkened for a flicker before he forced a laugh the kind he used to win over investors at cocktail parties. He raised his voice just loud enough for people to hear. "You look better than expected. Guess it wasn't that bad after all." A few guests flinched. Even now, he thought he could charm his way out of it. Thomas didn't respond. He just walked with me toward the center of the room, right where the violinist had played the night of the wedding. Lena took out the black folder and placed it on a table. The sound was soft, but the shift in the air was instant. I turned to face them, my parents, my sister, the crowd that had always applauded them and overlooked me. Caroline's voice trembled when she spoke. "Maddie, maybe we can talk about this privately. Please don't make this worse." Her words were laced with the same entitlement she'd been fed all her life. I didn't answer her. Thomas gave a small nod and Lena tapped her phone. A large projection screen behind us flickered to life. The ballroom fell into a hush as the opening frame of the video appeared. The footage had been pulled from one of the clearest live streams. The image showed me standing in front of my father, my jaw set, his hand gripping a champagne glass. Then the audio filled the room, sharp and undeniable. "Don't you dare embarrass us tonight." "It's mine. Not anymore." The sound of my body hitting the wall echoed through the speakers like thunder. Crack! The guests who hadn't been there the night of the wedding gasped audibly. Those who had been there lowered their eyes, suddenly confronted with the thing they had pretended to ignore. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, but not in horror, in panic. My father's face drained of its easy charm, leaving behind something colder, harder. Caroline's perfect posture crumpled. She whispered something to her fiancé, but he didn't move. The video kept playing, capturing every scream, every flash of camera phones, the chaos of the crowd. Then the screen froze on the image of my father's hand against my shoulder. My body bent back against the wall, blood visible in my hair. No one spoke. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Thomas stepped forward, his voice even. "No one here can say they didn't see it. This is not rumor. This is not interpretation. This is what happened." Lena opened the folder and placed the printed police report on the table next to the screen. The seal of the department shone faintly under the chandelier light. "Assault charges have been filed," she said clearly. "Multiple witnesses have given statements. This is no longer a private matter." My father tried to laugh again, a harsh bark of sound, but it cracked in the air like dry wood. His voice rose. "You think this will destroy me. People like you don't understand family loyalty." But he was no longer speaking to me. He was trying to salvage his audience, trying to turn them against me. I met his gaze without flinching. "This is what loyalty looks like to you. You hit me because I said no. That's not loyalty. That's ownership." My voice didn't shake. And in that silence, something shifted. The whispers that once belonged to his side were gone. The crowd wasn't looking at me with skepticism anymore. They were looking at him. Some looked at Caroline, and I could see the cracks forming in her perfect world. Her fiancé slowly stepped back as if realizing he was standing next to a house about to collapse. My mother tried to reach out and whisper something to me, probably another plea to keep quiet, but I stepped away from her touch. Thomas closed the folder with a soft snap. "We don't need to convince anyone," he said calmly. "We just need to let the truth breathe." And the truth was already filling the room like smoke impossible to put back in a box. Someone from the crowd shouted, "How could you do that to your own daughter?" Another voice added, "We all saw it. You can't hide this." The fragile social mask they had built for decades cracked like glass under a hammer. My father's jaw tightened. My mother whispered his name, but he didn't hear her. Caroline turned to me with eyes wide, but not with remorse. With fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes the world no longer believes their story. The brunch that was supposed to celebrate her new beginning had turned into a courtroom without walls, a public reckoning. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cry. I just stood there breathing as the truth did the work for me. The days after the brunch felt like living inside the eye of a storm that refused to quiet. The video that had already gone viral exploded into something larger, something I could not have contained even if I'd wanted to. National talk shows replayed the clip of my father slamming me against the wall in slow motion, while legal analysts discussed the possible charges on morning television. Every time I scrolled headlines, screamed words like wedding assault and family scandal. My father's name, once spoken with respect at charity galas and business events, was now trending alongside words like abuser power and downfall. News outlets dissected his history, his company, his reputation. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse as soon as the arrest warrant was confirmed. My phone lit up with messages from old acquaintances who had spent years ignoring me, but suddenly remembered my name now that the world was watching. Some apologized. Some offered weak excuses. Most just wanted to say they were on my side now. The strange thing was I didn't need them. I didn't need anyone to believe me anymore because the video had done what I never could. It made the world see. Thomas sat in my living room scrolling through updates on his tablet, Lena across from him, with a calm surgical precision in her voice as she explained the legal path ahead. Assault in a public setting with multiple witnesses, viral evidence, high-profile coverage. The police had moved quickly faster than anyone expected. My father had been taken into custody for processing less than 3 days after the wedding. They released him on bail, but his face on the news, handcuffed and silent, stripped away decades of polished charm. His law firm's statement was short and defensive, full of carefully chosen words that avoided the word guilty. But public opinion didn't need a court verdict to know what they'd seen with their own eyes. Caroline's world cracked next. Her wedding video had once been carefully edited for a highlight reel, but now it was buried under millions of stitches and reposts of the assault. Influencers, lawyers, survivors, and activists used it as an example of how power protects itself until it doesn't. Her husband's family released a statement condemning my father's actions and distancing themselves from the Coles entirely. By the end of the week, the marriage was effectively over. She stopped wearing her ring. The house she thought she would inherit was no longer hers to covet. The investors of my father's construction company withdrew their funding in rapid succession, citing irreversible damage to brand trust. Sponsors backed out of charity galas. The mayor's office released a statement cutting ties with any project involving his name. My father had built his world on image, and now it was collapsing in real time. Lena explained that the case had already gained the attention of advocacy groups, and some of the best pro bono lawyers in the state were offering support. But she was clear with me. This will be long, she said. Even with the video, even with the witnesses, power never dies quietly. I understood. My mother tried to reach me. She left voicemails every night, her voice swinging between trembling apologies and thinly veiled accusations. She said I was destroying the family, that this could ruin Caroline's life, that we could fix everything if I would just recant. Her words didn't move me anymore. They sounded like an old script she didn't know how to stop reading. Caroline's messages were worse. She accused me of stealing her future, said I was jealous that I'd always wanted to ruin things. She didn't understand that the thing was already ruined the moment my father hit me. It wasn't me who broke their perfect image. It was them. It always had been. Thomas told me not to respond to either of them. Every word mattered now. Lena recorded everything, building the kind of airtight case that left no room for their manipulation to breathe. We met with the DA's office on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom building loomed gray and silent, cameras already stationed outside. As we walked through the doors, I felt that knot in my stomach, the same one I'd carried my whole life around my family, begin to loosen. Inside, the assistant district attorney greeted us with a firmness I hadn't expected. She had already reviewed the evidence. The case was strong. Assault charges were moving forward, and they were also exploring enhanced penalties due to the public nature of the attack and the clear intent captured on video. For the first time, the law wasn't something hanging over me. It was something standing beside me. Meanwhile, the online wave kept growing. Survivors began tagging me in their stories, women and men telling their own versions of nights when no one believed them. It was overwhelming, humbling, and heavier than I could have imagined. but it was also powerful. It made me realize that this wasn't just about me. My father's downfall was no longer confined to our family's polished walls. It was a mirror being held up to every room like it. By the end of the second week, his name was removed from the board of his company. His friends in politics avoided him. His colleagues stayed silent. The house of power he'd built for decades had been undone in less than 14 days by a single act of violence he thought no one would ever hold him accountable for. Caroline disappeared from the public eye. My mother refused to leave the house. Their friends stopped answering their calls. I wasn't surprised. People who only loved the image don't stay when it breaks. Thomas and Lena worked late into the night drafting statements, coordinating with law enforcement, making sure no one could quietly pressure me behind closed doors. I recorded every interaction, every call, every text from my family, not because I wanted to expose them further, but because I knew exactly what people like them did when they lost control. They lied. They twisted. They turned soft words into knives. But this time I was ready. I had spent my whole life feeling like a ghost in my own family, a shadow at Caroline's side, a name they could erase when it suited them. Now they couldn't erase me. I was standing in front of the world with the truth, and they were the ones trying to hide in the dark. Late one night, as rain tapped softly against the windows of Magnolia Street, Thomas looked at me over a pile of legal documents and said, "Maddie, they're losing control." And it wasn't just them. For the first time in my life, I was the one holding the ground they couldn't take back. The fall of the Cole family didn't come with a single explosion. It came in quiet, steady cracks that grew louder by the day until the entire facade they had built finally split apart. The same people who once held their hands at charity galas now avoided them like a stain that couldn't be washed out. The same neighbors who had praised my father for being a pillar of the community now crossed the street when they saw him. It started with the company. My father's construction firm had once been the jewel of Savannah's business community, the kind of company that landed government contracts and built entire neighborhoods. But image was its foundation, not integrity. The board met behind closed doors and voted to remove him as CEO within a week of his arrest. They cited irreparable reputational damage, but everyone knew what it meant. Investors fled like birds sensing a storm. 3 major contracts were canceled within 48 hours. When I saw the headline announcing his resignation, there was no satisfaction in me, just a quiet recognition of something inevitable. He had built his empire on the backs of silence and fear. Without them, it collapsed. My mother's social world followed soon after. She had spent decades pretending to be the perfect hostess, the elegant woman with pearls at every dinner. But in Savannah's upper circles, loyalty was fragile. Friends who had once crowded her dining room table now ignored her invitations. At first, she tried to host a small gathering to rebuild her image. Only 3 people came. By the end of the night, they left early, leaving her alone in a house that suddenly felt too large for her voice to fill. Caroline tried to hold on longer than either of them. She gave interviews at first, her voice shaking as she tried to paint herself as collateral damage the poor sister caught in the middle. But the internet doesn't love scripted tears. It loves receipts, and there were plenty of them. Text messages she had sent me before the assault leaked. Her cruel comments about my house, about how she'd get it eventually, were now screenshotted and dissected by thousands of strangers online. The perfect bride image cracked. Her husband's family cut ties completely. The engagement ring was gone from her finger within 2 weeks, and the man who had once stood beside her at the altar was now photographed leaving their shared apartment with boxes. By the end of the month, Caroline was alone, her reputation burned not by a stranger, but by her own entitlement. I watched all of this unfold, not with revenge, but with clarity. Their world wasn't being destroyed by me. It was being destroyed by what they had always been. I didn't have to push. I just had to stop absorbing the blows. When the court date was set, the coverage intensified. News vans parked outside their gated community. Journalists filed stories titled "A Southern Family's Fall and the Viral Assault That Shattered the Coles." My father, who once couldn't walk through town without being greeted like a celebrity, now walked into court with cameras flashing like gunfire. He kept his head down, jaw tight. The man who once towered over me like an unshakable wall now looked small beneath the weight of something he couldn't control. My mother followed him, her pearls gone, her hair pinned back tightly, a brittle mask stretched over her face. Caroline did not show up. Inside the courtroom, Lena sat beside me while Thomas stood behind us, his arms folded. The ADA presented the case cleanly and without theatrics. The video was played again, projected on the wall like an unblinking witness. The sound of the impact echoed through the courtroom just as it had through the ballroom. The judge didn't look away. The jury didn't look away. The entire room absorbed the truth without needing my family's excuses. My father's lawyer tried to frame it as a moment of unfortunate drunken loss of control, a private family dispute, but no one was buying it. Not with millions of eyes still watching from outside those courtroom walls. When the verdict came, it wasn't a surprise. Guilty on all charges. Assault in the second degree. The sentence would be decided later, but the damage was already done. His power was gone. His voice carried no weight. He didn't look at me when they let him out in handcuffs. He just stared at the floor like a man who still didn't understand how the world had changed without his permission. My mother left the courtroom without a word. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just walked like someone carrying the weight of a broken kingdom on her shoulders. The house they lived in went up for sale not long after. Their accounts were bleeding from legal fees, public fallout, and collapsing business ties. It didn't matter how many lawyers they hired. They couldn't buy their way out of the truth anymore. Caroline tried to contact me once during the fallout. She sent a single message at 2 a.m, a rambling text that swung from blame to apology to blame again. She said she lost everything because of me. I didn't respond. She didn't lose everything because of me. She lost everything because she believed entitlement was a shield that would never crack. It wasn't my job to teach her otherwise. Their downfall rippled far beyond our family. It became a conversation. News panels talked about power entitlement and how family violence hides behind manicured lawns. Women wrote essays about how many times they had stayed silent to keep the peace. People shared their own stories, their own broken nights. It wasn't just my truth anymore. It was a mirror held up to thousands of others. And somewhere in that storm, I found a quiet strength I didn't know I had. I stopped being the background character in their story. I became the author of my own. On the day my father was sentenced, I stood outside the courthouse. The air was heavy gray clouds pressing down. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pushed forward, but their voices were a dull hum. Thomas stood beside me, Lena on my other side. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't burn. I was steady. My father received 3 years with additional restrictions for assault under public exposure. The sentence wasn't long, but it was enough. It wasn't about the number of years. It was about the fact that for once he couldn't walk away. My mother vanished into a quieter existence. No more galas, no more garden parties, no more pretending. Caroline moved out of state. I didn't follow where she went. Their fall wasn't mine to tend to. I didn't want their power or their name. I just wanted my peace. That evening, after the courthouse emptied, I drove home to Magnolia Street. The porch light glowed softly against the dusk. The magnolia trees swayed in the wind the same way they had when I rebuilt this house from nothing. I walked inside and felt the air wrap around me like something familiar. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It had weight history, my fingerprints in every corner, and it was still mine. Everything they had tried to take from me had only strengthened my grip on the one thing they could never claim. For years, they had taught me to be small. Their collapse taught me that I had never been small at all. I simply hadn't spoken loud enough, and now my voice filled the quiet like a promise that no one would ever erase me again. The first morning after the sentencing, the air around Magnolia Street felt different. The house had always been quiet, but that day, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt open. I walked barefoot across the oak floors I had sanded years ago, the wood warm from the early sun spilling through the windows. The magnolia trees outside were blooming again, their petals falling onto the sidewalk like soft white snow. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up bracing for someone else's demands. I didn't wake up waiting to defend what was mine. I just breathed. I brewed coffee slowly the way I used to when the house was still a construction site, when it was just me and the bones of the walls. I leaned against the doorway of the kitchen and listened to the sounds that were mine alone, the kettle hissing, the faint creak of the porch swing moving in the breeze. The house was not just a house anymore. It was proof of what I had built without them. For so long, I had poured every ounce of my strength into this place to escape the noise of my family's entitlement. But now, it wasn't a hiding place. It was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, reporters eventually moved on to other stories. Hashtags faded from trending lists. The city found new scandals to feed on. But here inside these walls, I didn't need the world to watch to know that something had changed forever. Thomas came over on a warm Saturday afternoon, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and the blueprint sketches he'd been working on for his next restoration project. He dropped them on this old kitchen table I'd rebuilt by hand and said, "You know, this house could be part of something bigger." I laughed because I'd spent years clinging to this house like it was the last thing I had. Now the idea of sharing it didn't scare me. It thrilled me. We spent that afternoon walking through every room talking about turning the house into a design gallery and architectural space, a place for students to learn preservation and restoration. It wasn't about profit. It was about legacy. My legacy. That night, I sat on the porch swing with my laptop scrolling through the messages that had come from strangers across the country. People still wrote to me even after the headlines cooled. They told me they had left abusive families, that they had drawn lines and kept them, that they had felt less alone watching someone else stand in a room and say, "It's mine." It was humbling. It was heavier than I could have imagined. But it was real. And it reminded me that my voice carried further than I ever thought it could. One evening, a woman who ran a local advocacy group for survivors reached out to ask if I would speak at an upcoming fundraiser. For years, I had been the silent one at every table, the person who blended into the background so Caroline could shine. The idea of standing on a stage felt strange, but I didn't hesitate. I said yes. The night of the event, the hall was filled with people, some in suits, some in jeans, all carrying their own stories behind their eyes. When I walked up to the microphone, the room went still. Not in fear, not in judgment, but in quiet expectation. I didn't give them a rehearsed speech. I told them about the house, about the years spent being overlooked, about how silence had been a cage built for me, about how it broke the moment my father slammed me against that wall and the whole world saw it. I didn't cry. My voice didn't crack. It was steady. And when I said, "No one gets to take what you built with your own hands, not even family," the applause that followed didn't feel like noise. It felt like a promise. A few weeks later, Thomas and I began the restoration program. College students, young designers, volunteers came to Magnolia Street to learn how to bring old buildings back to life. I watched them work with their hands covered in dust, their faces lit up as they learned how to make something stand again. It was a reflection of me years ago. It felt like planting something that would last longer than the bruises and courtrooms and news cycles. My mother's house was sold quietly through a broker. She sent me one letter, a single page folded neatly in an envelope. It wasn't an apology. It was a ghost of one full of excuses and regret tangled together. I read it once and tucked it away in a drawer. I didn't need her words to validate me anymore. Caroline never wrote. I never expected her to. She moved somewhere far away, chasing a new image, but I no longer existed in the world she built. And she no longer existed in mine. One early morning, just as the magnolia petals began to fall in the spring breeze, I sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee in my hands. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. I looked at the house and saw every version of myself that had lived here. The one who arrived with bleeding hands and stubborn dreams. The one who cowered when her father's voice filled the room. The one who stood up in front of hundreds and said, "It's mine." And the one who now sat in quiet peace, knowing that she had built something no one could tear down again. The neighborhood had changed too. People waved now when they passed. Neighbors who once dismissed me as the quiet sister now nodded with something that looked like respect. I hadn't set out to become a symbol. I just wanted to keep my house. But somewhere in that fight, I learned what power really was. Power wasn't about control. It wasn't about fear. It was about drawing a line and refusing to let anyone cross it. It was about looking at your past and saying, "You don't get to define me anymore." Thomas joined me on the porch that morning, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. He didn't have to say anything. We sat there in silence as the world woke up around us. The house stood tall behind us, the magnolia trees swaying gently in the wind. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was home. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for space. I was living in it. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had already won simply by refusing to disappear. When I look back on that night in the ballroom, the moment my father's hand slammed me against the wall, it no longer feels like the point where everything broke. It feels like the point where everything finally began to fall into place. For years, I lived believing silence was safer, that keeping the peace meant protecting myself, that staying small was the only way to survive the shadow of my family's power. But silence was never safety. It was their weapon. And when I said 3 simple words, "It's mine," the world heard what I had been too afraid to say for years. Those words were never just about the house. They were about my life, my name, my worth. What they tried to take from me wasn't bricks and wood. It was my voice. And when I took it back, everything they'd built on lies began to crumble. The house on Magnolia Street still stands stronger than ever. I walk its halls every morning barefoot against the wood I shaped myself, and I feel no fear anymore. Not of their shadows, not of their rage, not of what people think, because they don't get to define me. Not anymore. My father thought he could control the story forever. My mother believed appearances would protect them. Caroline believed she could inherit what she never built. But what they never understood was that truth doesn't ask for permission. It simply waits for the right moment to be seen. And once it is, it can't be buried again. I'm not naive. I know not every story ends with justice served and peace restored. But I also know this: every boundary we draw, every no we say, in the face of people who feel entitled to us matters. Even if no one claps, even if no one understands. Because it's not about them. It's about us choosing to live as our own person. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, hear me now. You don't owe anyone your silence. Not the people who hurt you. Not the ones who stood by and pretended not to see. You owe yourself the chance to stand in your own light, to build something no one can take from you. That's what I did. Not because I'm extraordinary, but because I got tired of letting them write my story for me. This house, this life, this quiet peace in the morning, I built it, and it's mine. If you've ever been where I was, I want you to know something simple. Your voice matters more than their control. Your boundaries matter more than their image, and your truth will always be louder than their denial if you let it breathe. So don't hand them the pen. Don't let them narrate who you are. Write it yourself, even if your hands are shaking. Especially then. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to thank you for listening, for seeing me, for standing with every person who has ever had to fight for their own worth. And now I want to ask you something. If this story made you think, if it made you feel, if it made you remember the lines you drew for yourself, tell me where you're listening from. Type boundaries in the comments. If you believe no means no. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Because sometimes all it takes is hearing someone else say it out loud to find your own voice. This is not just my story. It belongs to everyone who has ever been told to stay small. And we are not small. Not anymore. Subscribe if you believe in standing your ground. If you believe that no one has the right to take what is yours. Because the truth, your truth, is louder than any lie they'll ever tell. And once you speak it, they can never silence it again.